There is a man in a pit, not a metaphor. A real pit, a cistern with no water, only thick mud at the bottom, and a prophet slowly disappearing into it while the most powerful religious and political leaders in Jerusalem either put him there or turned away and said nothing. And the one person who decided to act was African. He did not send a message through someone safer. He walked directly into the king's palace, stood in a public place where powerful men could hear him, and said, "These men have done evil." Because of what he did, the prophet lived. And because of what he did, God responded to him personally, not with a general blessing for a crowd, a direct, spoken, individual promise of protection, just for him. That story is in your Bible right now. It has been there for over 2,600 years, and most of us never heard a sermon about it. Tonight we are going to ask why. Not with anger as the engine. With the text itself, original Hebrew, named scholars, verifiable history. We are going to walk through what the biblical narrative actually says about the people it calls Cush and Ethiopia. What role they carry across multiple books written centuries apart, and what a tradition that has been reading these texts for over 1,600 years has been saying about that role all along. By the time we finish, the question we started with will have changed. It will no longer be why did God make black people to suffer? It will be something older and something more demanding. It will be, now that you know what was always in the text, what are you going to do with it? There is a question that has lived quietly in the back of the mind of nearly every black Christian in America. Most people never say it out loud. Some feel guilty for even thinking it, but it is there. Underneath the sermons and the worship songs and the Sunday school lessons, persistent and patient and waiting for the right moment. If God made everyone, why did he make us to suffer? That is the question as most people carry it. And for generations, the tradition that shaped most black Americans gave one of two answers. The first answer was silence. The second answer was a verse stretched so far from its original meaning that it took centuries of scholarship to untangle the damage it caused. We will get to that verse. But first I want to suggest something that changes everything about how we approach this conversation. We have been asking the wrong question. Not because the pain behind the question is wrong. The pain is real. 400 years of documented, systematic suffering is not something you explain away with a theological refrain. The pain deserves to be honored, not dismissed. But the question, why did God make black people to suffer, already accepts a conclusion before examining the evidence. It assumes that suffering is the defining characteristic, the central fact, the primary story. And when you accept that framing, every answer you find will be shaped by that assumption before you even begin looking. The better question is this. When you read the biblical text carefully, with attention to the original languages, with awareness of the historical context, and with honest engagement with what scholars across multiple traditions have established, what portrait actually emerges of the people the Bible calls Cush and Ethiopia? What role do they play? Where do they appear? How are they described? And what has a tradition that has been reading those texts for over 1,600 years said about the significance of that portrait? That is a question the evidence can actually address. Now, I want to be honest about something that sits at the foundation of this entire conversation. For most of Christian history in the Western world, the people who held institutional authority to answer theological questions were a specific group. They controlled the seminaries. They controlled the publishing houses. They controlled which commentaries got printed and distributed and assigned to students. They decided which verses received extended treatment from the pulpit and which ones were read quickly and moved past without comment. This is not a claim about secret coordination or hidden agendas. It is a description of how institutions work in every era and in every tradition. Every institution emphasizes the parts of its founding text that align with its current priorities and gives less attention to the parts that complicate them. That is not unique to Christianity. It is simply what institutions do when they accumulate interpretive authority over time. Colin Kidd. In his book, The Forging of Race's Race, Scripture, and the Protestant Atlantic World, published by Cambridge University Press in 2006, documents this process with careful historical precision. His conclusion is not that every individual interpreter was acting in conscious bad faith. His conclusion is that the cumulative weight of interpretive choices made across generations produced a tradition with a very specific and very consistent shape. A shape that made African presence in Scripture consistently less visible than the text itself would suggest it should be. Not through a single dramatic decision. Through the quiet accumulation of what got sermon time and what got moved past, what received extended commentary and what appeared in a footnote, what was preached at Christmas and Easter and what was assigned to a Tuesday night Bible study that most people never attended. Howard Thurman, one of the most important theologians in the history of the Black Church, wrote in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, published by Beacon Press in 1949, about the experience of reading Scripture with your back against the wall. He described a quality of spiritual directness that comes from having no cushion between yourself and the ultimate questions. When the comfortable answers are not available to you because your circumstances make them impossible to believe, you either let go of the text entirely, or you hold onto it with a grip that forces you deeper into it than comfort would ever take you. The Black Church, across 400 years of pressure, chose to hold on. And in holding on, it found things in the text that the tradition around it was not emphasizing. Things that, when you look at them carefully with the tools of serious scholarship, turn out to be exactly what the text actually says. That is what we are going to find together tonight. What the text shows is something more specific and more demanding than any simple answer to suffering. It shows that a specific people appear at specific moments with a specific posture. A posture of reaching, a posture of moving toward God with urgency and intention before the surrounding world has made that movement safe or comfortable or rewarded. A posture that the prophets described with consistency and that the narrative confirmed through the figures who acted from it. We are going to find that posture in the text. We are going to follow it through the story. And by the time we are done, the question of why God created Black people will have an answer grounded not in what someone decided to tell you, but in what the text itself has been showing for 3,000 years. Let us begin at the beginning. I want you to picture something before we open the text. Picture a room full of people who have been told their entire lives that their family history begins with a ship, that everything before the ship is either unknown or irrelevant, that the story of their people, as far as the tradition they inherited is concerned, starts with chains and ends with waiting for someone else to write the next chapter. Now imagine handing someone in that room a text that places their geographic heritage in the second chapter of the oldest book they own. Not at the margins, not in a footnote, in the description of where everything began. That is what the Hebrew text of Genesis actually does. Genesis chapter 2 gives us 4 rivers flowing out of Eden. 2 of them are familiar. The Tigris and the Euphrates are rivers we can find on any modern map. But the text also names the Gihon, and it describes it in specific terms. It is the one, the text says, that flows around the whole land of Cush. Cush. In the second chapter of Genesis, before any covenant, before any patriarch, before Israel exists as a concept, before the call of Abraham, before the Exodus, before the giving of the law at Sinai, before any of the moments that Western Christianity tends to treat as the real beginning of the story, The land of Cush is named as part of the geography of human origin. Sit with that for a moment, because it deserves more than a quick read. The writers of Genesis, when they described the world at its beginning, when they painted the landscape of where everything started, included the land of Cush in that landscape. Africa was not added to the biblical story later. It was woven into the description of where the story began. Now let us look at the word that names the first human being. In English, Adam functions primarily as a proper name. It is the name of the first man, and that is how most sermons treat it. But in Hebrew, the word Adam is not simply a name. It is a word with a meaning, and that meaning is directly connected to the word Adamah, which refers to ground, soil, earth. The text is making a connection between the first human being and the earth from which he was formed. His name carries the substance of the ground itself. John H. Walton, a respected Old Testament scholar at Wheaton College, in his book The Lost World of Genesis 1, published by IVP Academic in 2009, argues that Genesis is not primarily a text about material origins in the modern scientific sense. It is a text about function and purpose and order. When the text describes what humans are made from and what they are named for, it is making a statement about their relationship to the created world. I want to be precise here. Walton does not draw a geographic connection between the word Adam and Africa. What the text gives us is something worth noting on its own terms. It gives us a name whose meaning is inseparable from the earth itself. And in the same chapter, it gives us a geography of human origin that explicitly names the land of Cush among the rivers of Eden. Those are two distinct observations, and together, they establish something that is easy to miss when you have been reading Genesis through a single interpretive lens for your entire life. The world the text describes at the beginning of human history is not a world where African geography is absent or peripheral. It is a world where African geography is named in the same breath as the rivers that flowed from the garden. Now let us move to Genesis chapter 10, the Table of Nations. This is one of the most consistently overlooked passages in the entire Old Testament. It is a genealogical and geographic record of the nations as the ancient Hebrew writers understood them. It traces the descendants of Noah's 3 sons and maps the known world through those family lines. Ham's descendants are listed in chapter 10, verse 6. And the first name in that list is Cush, not second, not somewhere in the middle of a long genealogy. First, Umberto Cassuto, the Italian Hebrew scholar whose commentary on Genesis, published by Magnus Press, remains one of the most detailed linguistic analyses of the text available, engages directly with the positioning of names in these genealogies. In Hebrew literary convention, the arrangement of a genealogical sequence reflects the writer's understanding of significance and priority. What is named first is not simply a random starting point. It is a signal. And in the Table of Nations, when the descendants of Ham are listed, the people who will become the inhabitants of the African Northeast are named before Egypt, before Canaan, before any of the other nations that would become central to the biblical narrative. I want you to stop here for a moment and feel what that actually means. Before the covenant with Abraham, before the Exodus, before the kingdom of David, before any of the great turning points that fill the rest of the Old Testament, Cush is already there, already named, already first in the genealogical record of the nations the biblical writers understood as the known world. I remember the first time I traced this carefully through the original text. I had grown up with a Bible I loved and knew well, and I had never noticed that Cush was first in that list. Not because the text had hidden it, because I had never been taught to stop and look. When I stopped and looked, something shifted, because the position of Cush in that list is not a minor detail. It is a statement about how the writers of the ancient Hebrew text understood the world and the peoples in it. And the statement they made placed Cush first. Randall Bailey, a Hebrew Bible scholar who has written extensively on African presence in the Old Testament, notes in his academic work that the consistent pattern of Western interpretation has been to treat these references as background details rather than as foregrounded narrative elements. His argument, supported by careful textual analysis, is that the de-emphasis of African figures in the early chapters of Genesis reflects interpretive choice rather than textual necessity. The text names them. The tradition decided not to linger. We are going to linger, because the origin story the Hebrew text tells is not a story that begins in a world where African peoples are absent. It is a story that begins with a garden whose rivers touch the land of Cush. It is a story whose first genealogical record names Cush before Egypt and before Canaan. It is a story in which one of the first described rulers of ancient civilization, Nimrod the son of Cush in verses 8 through 12, is identified as a man of extraordinary power who founded cities and built kingdoms. That is the Genesis the Hebrew text contains. And it is the Genesis most of us were never taught to read. If Genesis gives us the geographic anchor, the prophetic books give us something more specific. They give us Cush with a role. Not just Cush as a place on a map. Not just Cush as a name in a genealogy. Cush as a people with a particular posture toward God. A people who appear in the prophetic literature not as background, not as enemies to be defeated, not as nations standing in Israel's way, but as worshipers, as participants, as people the prophets saw in their visions of the future and felt compelled to name. To understand why that matters, you need to understand something about how Hebrew prophecy works. The prophetic books of the Old Testament are visionary literature. They describe what the prophets saw when they looked beyond the present moment toward what they believed God was doing in history. And the way they described what they saw, the images they chose, the names they included, the order in which they arranged things, all of that was intentional. Prophetic literature is carefully crafted. Details are rarely accidental. With that in mind, let us look at 3 texts that name Cush most explicitly and most significantly. The first is Isaiah chapter 18. The entire chapter is a vision directed toward a specific people, and the description the prophet gives is remarkable. He describes a nation beyond the rivers of Cush, a people tall and smooth-skinned, a nation feared far and wide, powerful and aggressive, whose land the rivers divide. This is not a description of weakness or marginality. This is a description that carries the weight of genuine recognition. The prophet sees a people of substance, of stature, of consequence in the world. And then verse 7 describes what happens in the vision. This people, described in those terms, will bring gifts to Mount Zion, to the place of the name of the Lord of hosts. The movement in Isaiah 18 is from description to destination. The prophet first establishes who these people are, their physical presence, their power, their geographic identity, and then he describes where they are going and what they are bringing when they get there. The Hebrew construction points toward voluntary offering rather than compelled tribute. This is the kind of gift-bringing that represents a relationship, a recognition, a turning toward something chosen rather than demanded. Isaiah chapter 18 is positioned within a sequence of oracles about various nations. What is notable about the oracle concerning Cush is that its concluding movement is not judgment or defeat, but the bringing of gifts to Zion. That destination distinguishes the chapter within its context in a way that careful readers of the prophetic corpus have noted across multiple traditions. Stop for a moment and feel the weight of that. A people described as powerful and feared in the ancient world. A people whose land the rivers divide. And the prophet's vision of where they end up is not conquest, not subjugation, not disappearance. It is Mount Zion, bringing gifts, voluntarily, as people who chose to come. The second text is Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 10. From beyond the rivers of Cush, my worshippers, the daughter of my dispersed ones, shall bring my offering. Read that phrase carefully. My worshippers. This is God speaking. And the possessive is direct and unqualified. Not worshippers in general. Not people who will eventually become worshippers if certain conditions are met. My worshippers. The text identifies them, in the prophetic vision, as already belonging to the category of those who worship. And then the second phrase, the daughter of my dispersed ones. This is covenant language. The word dispersed in this context carries the weight of a people who have been scattered but not abandoned. A people separated from a center but who remain in relationship with the one who established that center. The scattering is real, but the belonging is not revoked. Will Gaffney, a Hebrew Bible scholar whose work on African figures in the Old Testament has been published in peer-reviewed academic journals, has written about this verse as one of the most direct expressions of covenantal inclusion for a non-Israelite people in the prophetic corpus. Her reading is careful, and her conclusion is measured. She does not overstate what the text says, but she also does not allow it to be minimized. The verse says what it says. A people beyond the rivers of Cush are identified as belonging to God. The daughter of my dispersed ones. I have read that phrase in many different moments of my life, and it has never landed lightly. The third text is Psalm 68 verse 31. Princes shall come out of Egypt. Cush shall hasten to stretch out her hands to God. The Hebrew verb translated as hasten carries urgency and intentionality. This is not reluctant compliance. This is active, forward motion, hands reaching, not folded in passive waiting, stretched out with the urgency of people who know where they are going. Now here is what becomes visible when you read these three texts together. In Isaiah 18, Cush brings gifts to Zion voluntarily. In Zephaniah 3:10, a people beyond the rivers of Cush are called my worshippers by God directly. In Psalm 68:31, Cush hastens to stretch out her hands to God before the wealth transfer described in the surrounding verses has fully resolved. The pattern across these three texts, written in different centuries by different prophetic voices, is consistent. Cush is not described as a people who resist God or who need to be conquered before they can participate. The portrait that emerges is of a people who move toward God, a people whose movement is described with specificity and urgency, and in Zephaniah's case with a possessive that implies prior relationship. I want to be clear about what I am claiming and what I am not, because this is where intellectual honesty matters most. These three texts do not establish a formal theological doctrine about a unique calling, assigned exclusively to one racial group for all of history. That would go beyond what the texts actually say. What they do, read together, is form a consistent portrait. A portrait held and read seriously for over 1,600 years by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. A portrait that a growing body of academic scholarship in African American biblical hermeneutics has been examining with care. Not a doctrine of supremacy. A portrait of a specific people described, across multiple prophetic voices, as moving toward God with urgency and intention. Ephraim Isaac, a scholar of Ethiopian studies and Semitic languages, has written about the deep connection between Ethiopian biblical interpretation and these prophetic texts. His work, along with that of Edward Ullendorf in Ethiopia and the Bible, published by the British Academy in 1968, establishes that the Ethiopian interpretive tradition is not a later addition to the conversation about these passages. It is one of the oldest continuous conversations about them that exists anywhere in the world. That church read these texts and saw themselves, not because they were projecting a modern identity onto an ancient document, because the text named them, by the geography of their homeland, by the rivers that ran through their land, by the posture of worship that the prophets described with a consistency that spans centuries and books and prophetic voices. They saw themselves because the text put them there. And now so can you. There is a difference between being present and being positioned. A crowd can be present at an event and have no particular role in it. But when a text places a specific people at a specific moment, describes their action with a specific verb, and surrounds that action with a specific context, the question of positioning becomes unavoidable. The question is not just are they there? The question is, what are they doing? And why does the text make sure you know it? That is what this chapter is going to examine. Psalm 68 is one of the longest and most complex psalms in the entire collection. It opens with a declaration of God rising up and enemies scattering. It moves through images of God as the father of the fatherless and the defender of widows. It describes a procession, a movement, a God who leads captives in triumph and ascends to the heights. Biblical scholars describe this as coronation language, the language of a victory march, of power being established, of a new order coming into being. And then in the middle of that procession, in the middle of that coronation language, the text pauses to name who is coming forward. Princes from Egypt, Cush hastening to stretch out her hands to God. The context matters enormously. This is not a quiet moment. This is not a peripheral scene. This is the coronation procession of God. And within that procession, within that moment of cosmic significance, the text specifically names Cush as one of the peoples who comes forward. And the way Cush comes forward is not with tribute, not with political allegiance, not with the kind of gesture a conquered people makes toward a conquering king. Cush comes forward with hands stretched out toward God. Walter Brueggemann, in his work on the Psalms and on what he calls the prophetic imagination, has written extensively about how the Psalms function as alternative descriptions of reality. They are counter-narratives. They describe a world ordered by God's justice rather than by human empire. And within that counter-narrative, the specific peoples named carry significance precisely because of who they are in the world the psalm is pushing back against. Now let us look at what the text actually shows us here, building the portrait fully before we speak to its limits. Across the three prophetic texts we examined, Cush is consistently described as a people who move toward God on their own initiative, not drawn in from the outside, not compelled, moving with the urgency the Hebrew verb describes. The verb in Psalm 68 is active and urgent. The description in Isaiah 18 is of a people who bring gifts to Zion voluntarily. The language in Zephaniah 3:10 calls them my worshippers before it calls them anything else. In the priestly theology of the Hebrew Bible, the function of the priest is not primarily to be morally superior to everyone else. The function of the priest is to stand at the intersection, to be the person who moves between the human and the divine, to carry the prayers of the people upward and to bring the presence of God downward. The priest is defined by a specific kind of directional movement between two realities that the rest of the world experiences as separate. Exodus chapter 19, verse 6, describes Israel as a kingdom of priests. At its core, that phrase describes a mediating function, a people whose existence in the world is meant to create a point of connection between the human community and the divine presence. That portrait maps directly onto what the prophets describe when they describe Cush, a people in motion toward God, a people whose defining action is reaching, a people whose identity in the prophetic imagination is inseparable from their orientation toward the divine. Now I want to be direct about what the text supports and what it does not, because precision here is part of respecting what the text actually says. What Psalm 68 verse 31 directly supports is this. In the psalmist's vision of God's procession, Cush is named as a people who hasten to stretch out their hands toward God. The action is worship. The quality of the action is urgency and intentionality. That is what the text shows. What the text does not establish is a formal doctrine of unique racial calling assigned exclusively to one group for all of history. Brueggemann himself would not make that claim from this text. No mainstream academic commentary on the Psalms draws that conclusion, and I am not going to claim what the evidence does not support. What the long-standing interpretive tradition does observe, carefully and consistently, is something more grounded and more interesting. Rodney Sadler, in his academic work on race and the Hebrew Bible, has argued that the portrait of Cush in the prophetic literature is consistently one of a people in voluntary relationship with God. His work does not claim racial supremacy for any group. It claims that the texts themselves describe a particular quality of orientation that the prophets associated with this specific people. The interpretive tradition of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has read this portrait for over 1,600 years and has drawn from it a theology of identity and vocation, not supremacy, a particular way of standing in relation to God that the prophets described with consistency and that the narrative confirmed through the figures who acted from it. That is the portrait the text carries, a portrait that has been preserved, read, and lived by a community that never stopped reading it. A portrait that speaks to a quality of relationship with God that the prophets saw in a specific people and described with specific and consistent language across centuries. The people the Bible calls Cush are described, repeatedly, across multiple books, by multiple prophetic voices, as a people who reach toward God, not reluctantly, not under compulsion, but with the urgency of hands that know where they are going. And if you are part of the diaspora that traces its roots to those same geographic regions, this portrait is part of your inheritance, not because someone assigned it to you, because the text placed it there, centuries before the ships, centuries before the erasure, centuries before anyone tried to tell you that your people had no place in the story. The hands have always been reaching. This is the chapter I have been building toward, not because it is the most dramatic, but because it is the most necessary. Because if we talk about calling and purpose and prophetic identity without talking about suffering, we are not being honest. And the people this video is made for have been surrounded by dishonest frameworks for long enough. So, let us be honest. The history of Black people in America includes 400 years of documented, systematic, brutal suffering, slavery, Reconstruction betrayed, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, the kind of generational trauma that researchers are now able to measure in the body, in the nervous system, in patterns of stress response that pass from parent to child without anyone choosing to transmit them. These are not talking points. These are documented realities that shape the lives of real people right now, today, in ways that cannot be spiritualized away with the right verse. And the theological question that has haunted the Black church for as long as the Black church has existed is this: how do you hold that suffering alongside any claim of divine calling? How do you say that God saw your people? That God named your people in Scripture? That God positioned your people at decisive moments in the biblical narrative? And also account for 400 years of what happened? That question deserves a serious answer. Not a slogan, not a verse pulled out of context and handed to someone in pain, as though pain is something you can resolve with the right combination of words. A serious engagement with what the biblical narrative itself says about the relationship between calling and suffering. Because here is what most Western theological education did not teach us to notice. The pattern in the biblical narrative is not that the called people are protected from suffering. The pattern is the opposite. Start with Joseph. Joseph is described in Genesis as someone favored by God from the beginning. His dreams are prophetic. His brothers recognize something about him they cannot fully articulate. And that recognition is part of what makes them afraid of him. He carries something that cannot be easily named but cannot be ignored either. And then his brothers throw him into a pit. They sell him to traders. He ends up in Egypt as a slave. He is falsely accused by someone with power over him. He is imprisoned. Years pass. He sits in a foreign prison in a foreign country with no human explanation for why any of this is happening to a man whose dreams pointed toward elevation and honor. I have sat with that gap many times. The gap between the promise and the pit, between the dream and the prison floor, between what the vision said and what the world did. The text does not tidy that gap up. It does not offer a theological disclaimer that makes the suffering make sense from the inside. It leaves the gap there, real and heavy, for the reader to sit with. What the text does is follow the story through. And when the resolution comes, when Joseph finally stands in the position the dreams pointed to, the text gives him a line that has become one of the most quoted in Genesis. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." That is not a dismissal of the suffering. Joseph does not say the pit was not real. He does not say the prison was not real. He does not say the years of waiting were not real. He says that alongside the human intention to destroy, there was a divine intention running in a different direction. And the divine intention was not finished yet when the suffering was at its worst. Now take the larger story of Israel and Egypt. Israel spends 400 years in Egypt. 400 years of slavery. The text in Deuteronomy chapter 26 describes it directly. The Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us and laid on us hard labor. This is not metaphor. This is a people describing generations of forced labor, of systematic oppression, of the kind of suffering that reshapes a culture from the inside out. And the call at Sinai, the covenant at the mountain, the declaration of Exodus 19:6. "You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation," comes after the 400 years, not before. The calling is not given to a comfortable people with nothing to lose. It is given to a people who have just come through the fire. Howard Thurman, whose theological reflection on the experience of the disinherited remains one of the most profound contributions to American religious thought, observe that there is a quality of spiritual clarity that comes from having no cushion between yourself and the ultimate questions. When your back is against the wall, you cannot afford a theology that does not actually hold. You need something that works when everything else has failed. Thurman was not romanticizing suffering. He was describing something he had observed in the historical experience of Black Christians in America. A directness of prayer. A refusal to let go of God even when God felt absent. A persistence of worship that did not depend on comfortable circumstances because comfortable circumstances were rarely available. And here is what he connected that observation to. He connected it to Jesus himself. Jesus, Thurman pointed out, was not born into comfort or security. He was born into a people living under occupation, in a region under military control, in a family that had to flee political violence before he was old enough to walk. The message he carried was shaped by that context. The people who received it most readily were the people who recognized their own situation in it. Now I want to address directly something that comes up whenever this conversation happens. Deuteronomy chapter 28 contains a long section of covenant consequences, including verses that describe a people being scattered, carried away in ships to a distant land, and living as slaves. Some teachers have read these verses as a direct prophecy about the transatlantic slave trade and about Black Americans specifically. I want to be honest about what mainstream scholarship says here. The consensus among academic biblical scholars is that Deuteronomy chapter 28 was written in the context of the Babylonian exile and describes the consequences of covenant unfaithfulness for ancient Israel in that specific historical context. Applying these verses directly to Black Americans as a group requires interpretive steps that go beyond what the text itself supports. At the same time, I want to be honest about something else. The experience of reading Deuteronomy chapter 28 through the lens of the transatlantic slave trade has been spiritually significant for millions of Black people who found in those words a framework for understanding suffering that was otherwise incomprehensible. That experience of recognition is real. It is not something to dismiss. What I am asking is that we hold both of those things at once. Scholarly precision about what the text was originally addressing, and genuine respect for the spiritual experience of people who found themselves in its words. Those two things do not have to cancel each other out. What the biblical narrative does support, with consistency and clarity, is this larger pattern. The people the text positions for significant purposes are not protected from the depths. They go through the depths. Joseph goes through the pit and the prison. Israel goes through 400 years of slavery. Jeremiah goes through the cistern. The servant in Isaiah 53 goes through suffering so profound that the text describes him as a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. The pattern is not suffering as punishment. The pattern is suffering as passage, not in a way that makes the suffering acceptable or something to be grateful for in a simple sense, but in a way that the biblical narrative returns to again and again. The called go through fire. And what comes out on the other side is something the fire did not destroy because it was made of something the fire cannot touch. James H. Cone, in his landmark work The Cross and the Lynching Tree, published by Orbis Books in 2011, drew a direct and theologically serious line between the crucifixion of Jesus and the experience of Black Americans under racial terror. His argument was not sentimental. It was structural. He argued that the cross only makes full theological sense when it is read alongside the experience of people who have been systematically dehumanized and killed by the powerful. And he argued that the Black church, because of its history, has access to a reading of the crucifixion that the comfortable church cannot reach. Cone was not arguing that suffering is good. He was arguing that the God of the biblical narrative is present in the suffering in a specific way, and that the people who have been in the depths have a particular kind of witness to offer about who God is and what God does in the darkest places. That is the testimony of suffering. Not that the suffering was God's intention for its own sake. Not that any people deserved what was done to them, but that the biblical pattern from Joseph to Israel in Egypt to Jeremiah in the cistern to the servant in Isaiah to the cross itself is a pattern of calling going through suffering and coming out on the other side with something that the suffering was not able to destroy. And the Black church, for 400 years, has been living that pattern. In the slave ships there was prayer. In the fields there were songs that carried theology more sophisticated than most academic commentaries. In the basement prayer meetings that law and custom tried to prevent, there was a persistence of faith that did not depend on institutional permission. In the civil rights movement, led by the church and grounded in the text, there was a reading of Exodus that was not metaphor. It was direct application. These people knew what it meant to be in Egypt. They were not reading about it from a distance. The testimony of suffering is this. The called people are not the people who avoided the fire. They are the people who went through it and are still here, still praying, still reaching, still stretching out their hands. And the text has been waiting for them to know that the reaching was never random. It was always the posture of people who were made for something the fire could not burn away. There is a difference between a story that includes you and a story that needs you. Most of us grew up with a version of the biblical narrative where African figures were included. They were there, in the background, in a verse that got read quickly on the way to somewhere else. The Ethiopian eunuch got one Sunday school lesson. Simon of Cyrene got mentioned during Holy Week. The Queen of Sheba got referenced when the sermon needed an illustration about wealth. But included is not the same as needed. What I want to show you in this chapter is something different. I want to show you that at 6 specific moments in the biblical narrative, moments when the story was at a turning point, moments when what happened next would determine the direction of everything that followed. The text places an African figure not in the background but at the center, not as decoration but as the person whose action, whose courage, whose initiative made the difference. These are not crowd scenes. These are hinge points. And at each one the text makes sure you know exactly who is standing there. The first figure is a woman whose name the text never gives us. Open to Numbers chapter 12. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married. For he had married a Cushite woman. That repetition is not a scribal error. In Hebrew literary practice, saying the same thing twice in the same breath signals emphasis. The writer is telling you, do not move past this detail. This detail is the point. The conflict that follows involves 2 of the most celebrated leaders in the entire Exodus narrative. Miriam is not a minor character. She is called a prophetess in Exodus chapter 15. She led the women of Israel in song after the crossing of the Red Sea. The book of Micah names her alongside Moses and Aaron as one of 3 leaders God sent before the people. One of the most respected figures in the entire narrative raises this challenge. And the conflict she raises is anchored by one specific fact. Moses married a Cushite woman. And that fact was the problem. Now look at what happens. God calls all 3 of them to the tent of meeting. God speaks directly. God defends Moses. And when the divine presence withdraws, Miriam is struck with a skin condition described in the Hebrew as tsarat, the same word translated elsewhere as leprosy. The narrative begins with a challenge to a Cushite woman's presence and ends with a divine response that turns entirely toward the people who raised the challenge. Yoren. The Cushite woman does not speak in this passage. She does not argue her case. She does not defend herself. She does not need to. Because God responds before she has to say a single word. Will Gaffney, a Hebrew Bible scholar whose work on women in the Old Testament is among the most rigorous in the field, has written about this passage as a moment of divine intervention on behalf of a woman whose identity is the explicit source of the conflict. The repetition of the Cushite identifier in verse 1 is not incidental. It is the text's way of making sure the reader understands what the conflict is actually about. That story has been in Numbers for over 2,600 years. And most of us never heard a sermon about it. The second figure is Ebed-Melech. We need to understand the situation he walks into. Jeremiah has been delivering prophecies that the leaders of Jerusalem do not want to hear. He has told them the city will fall. He has told them their resistance to Babylon is futile. For saying these things he has been beaten, imprisoned, put in stocks, and now thrown into a cistern with no water, only mud. Jeremiah chapter 38 tells us he sank into the mud. This is a man slowly dying while everyone with the power to stop it either put him there or turned away. And then the text introduces Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian. He goes to the king. He goes in public. At the Benjamin Gate, one of the main gathering places of the city. He names what happened as evil. He makes his case in front of people who can hear him. This is not a quiet act of private kindness. This is a public, politically risky intervention on behalf of a man that the most powerful people in Jerusalem just tried to kill. The king listens. The king gives Ebed-Melech authority to act. And then look at what Ebed-Melech does before he lowers the ropes into the cistern. He sends for old rags and worn-out clothes. He puts them under Jeremiah's arms, between the ropes and the skin, so that the ropes will not cut into him on the way up. He thought about whether the ropes would hurt. I have read that detail many times and it still stops me every time. Not just rescue. Kare. He thought about the pain of rope on skin that had already been through enough. He added that thought to his action without being asked, and without anyone requiring it of him. There is a kind of courage that acts. And then there is a rarer kind of courage that acts and also thinks about how to make the acting gentle. Ebed-Melech had both. Now look at what God does in response. Jeremiah chapter 39 verses 15 through 18. God speaks a personal prophecy to Ebed-Melech through Jeremiah. I will deliver you on that day. You shall not be given into the hand of the men of whom you are afraid. For I will surely save you, and you shall not fall by the sword, but you shall have your life as a prize of war, because you have put your trust in me. The book of Jeremiah is 52 chapters long. It is filled with kings, priests, officials, false prophets, and soldiers. Very few of them receive a personal word of divine protection like this. The ones who do are people the text identifies as having acted in faithfulness at a moment when faithfulness was rare and costly. One of them is an Ethiopian man who worked in a foreign king's palace. John Bright, in his commentary on Jeremiah published in the Anchor Bible series, notes the literary significance of the Ebed-Melech episode as a moment of moral clarity within the broader narrative of Jerusalem's failure. Kathleen O'Connor, in her work, Jeremiah Pain and Promise, published by Fortress Press in 2011, describes how Ebed-Melech functions as a counter-narrative, an outsider acting with greater integrity than the insiders at the most critical moment in the story. The book of Jeremiah is largely a story of failure. The leaders fail, the priests fail, the false prophets fail, the kings fail, and in the middle of all that failure, the text places an Ethiopian man who does not fail, who sees clearly, speaks boldly, acts with care, and receives a personal divine response. If you have ever been the only person in a room willing to speak up, where everyone around you saw what was happening and chose silence, and where you had to decide whether to act anyway, then Ebed-Melech is your text. The third figure is the Queen of Sheba. 1 Kings chapter 10 verse 1. Now, when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. Stop at that word. Test. The Hebrew word is nasa, which carries the meaning of examining, proving, putting to the test. This is not a courtesy visit. This is not a woman arriving to admire a man she has heard good things about. This is a head of state with a specific intellectual agenda. She has questions. She has standards. She came to see if Solomon measures up. And the questions she brings are described as chidot, a word referring to difficult riddles and complex intellectual challenges. This woman traveled an enormous distance with specific intellectual content ready for deployment. She is not a visitor. She is an examiner. The text tells us Solomon answered all her questions. And then the queen delivers her assessment. The report was true that I heard in my own land of your words and of your wisdom. But I did not believe the reports until I came and my own eyes had seen it. And behold, the half was not told me. She evaluated. She applied her standard. She concluded that the reality exceeded her expectations. And she said so in terms that are among the most generous recorded assessments of Solomon anywhere in the biblical text. Now, I want to be honest about geography, because this is where careful scholarship matters. The location of Sheba has been genuinely debated. One major scholarly position places ancient Sheba in the Arabian Peninsula, in what is now Yemen, where there is significant archaeological evidence for a powerful Sabaean kingdom. A second major position connects Sheba to the Horn of Africa, pointing to ancient trading connections across the Red Sea and Sabaean cultural influences in the archaeological record of northern Ethiopia. Edward Ullendorf, in Ethiopia and the Bible, argues for a geographic identity that overlapped both sides of the Red Sea in ancient usage. The honest answer is that the ancient world did not use the sharp geographic boundaries we apply today. The Red Sea was a trade corridor, not a wall. What is not in debate is the portrait the canonical text itself paints: a woman of extraordinary wealth, political authority, and intellectual capability. She initiates, she tests, she evaluates, she gives generously. She is presented with the dignity of a royal and intellectual equal, and the text records all of this without reservation and without any diminishment of who she is. That portrait has been in 1 Kings for over 2,000 years. The fourth figure appears in a single verse that most people read past in less than 3 seconds. Mark chapter 15 verse 21. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. Most sermons stop at the act. Simon carries the cross. But notice what Mark does immediately after naming him. He names his sons, Alexander and Rufus, in a gospel known for its speed and economy of language. Mark stops to record the names of this man's children. In ancient literary practice, names were included in a narrative when the audience was expected to recognize them. When Mark writes the father of Alexander and Rufus, he is not providing background for strangers. He is using familiar names to anchor an unfamiliar detail. He is saying, in effect, you know who these men are? This is their father. This is what happened to him. Cyrene was a major city on the northern coast of Africa in what is now Libya. Acts chapter 2 verse 10 mentions people from Cyrene among those present in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. Acts chapter 6 verse 9 mentions a synagogue of the Cyrenians in Jerusalem. Acts chapter 13 verse 1 lists Lucius of Cyrene among the prophets and teachers in the church at Antioch. And Romans chapter 16 verse 13 contains a greeting from Paul to a Rufus in Rome, described as chosen in the Lord, whose mother Paul describes as having been like a mother to him. James D.G. Dunn, in his commentary on Romans, in the Word Biblical Commentary series, notes the historical plausibility of a connection between the Rufus of Romans 16 and the son of Simon of Cyrene, while being clear that certainty is not available from the evidence. The connection is possible and has been considered seriously by scholars. It remains in the category of plausible rather than confirmed. What is confirmed is this: a North African man was present at the crucifixion. His name stayed in the story. His family stayed in the story. And Mark made sure his readers knew exactly where he came from. The fifth figure is the Ethiopian official in Acts chapter 8. Philip is directed to go toward the road from Jerusalem down to Gaza. On that road he encounters a man. And Luke, one of the most intentional writers in the New Testament, describes him with a precision that is not accidental. He is Ethiopian. He is a eunuch. He is an official of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians. In charge of all her treasury, he had come to Jerusalem to worship, and he is now returning home, seated in his chariot, reading the prophet Isaiah. Every detail matters. He controls the entire treasury of a queen. He made a long and difficult journey specifically to seek God, and he is reading Isaiah chapter 53 on the way home. The suffering servant passage, one of the most theologically complex texts in the entire Hebrew Bible. You do not stumble into this passage. You read it because you are searching. Philip runs to the chariot. Do you understand what you are reading? And the Ethiopian official answers, How can I? Unless someone guides me. And he invites Philip in. Philip did not find a man who knew nothing about God. He found a man who had already traveled to Jerusalem to worship, who was already reading one of the most profound prophetic texts in the Bible, and who was hungry enough for deeper understanding that he welcomed a conversation with a stranger on the road. The gospel came to this man not as news about a God he had never heard of. It came as the answer to questions he was already asking. Philip explained the text. The man received the explanation. He asked to be baptized. There is water by the road. Philip baptizes him. And then the text says something worth sitting with. The Spirit of the Lord carried Philip away, and the eunuch saw him no more, and went on his way, rejoicing. He went on his way, rejoicing, back to Ethiopia, back to the court of Candace, carrying what he had received. There is a genuine scholarly debate about whether this official represents the first Gentile conversion in Acts. Acts chapter 2 records people from multiple nations, including regions of Africa, receiving the gospel at Pentecost before Acts chapter 8, which makes the question of chronological primacy genuinely complex. The most accurate description is that this Ethiopian official is among the earliest named individuals to receive the gospel in a personal encounter as recorded in Acts. What is not in dispute is that Luke described him with extraordinary detail, and that detail was a deliberate choice by one of the most careful writers in the New Testament. The sixth figure is actually a group of figures, and they change the shape of the faith you practice today. Augustine was born in the year 354 in Thagaste, in the Roman province of Numidia in what is now northeastern Algeria. He lived, worked, ministered, and died on African soil. He never lived in Europe. And yet the theological framework that shaped the Protestant Reformation, Luther's understanding of grace, Calvin's understanding of predestination, runs directly through his work. Athanasius was born around the year 296 in Alexandria, Egypt. He defended what became Orthodox Trinitarian theology against enormous institutional and political pressure. He was exiled from his position 5 times by emperors who favored competing theological positions. He returned 5 times. And the creed that billions of Christians still recite today reflects the theology he refused to abandon. Tertullian was born around the year 155 in Carthage, in what is now Tunisia. He was the first writer known to use the Latin word trinitas in a Christian theological context. When you use the word Trinity, you are using a term that a man from Carthage in North Africa introduced to Christian theological vocabulary. Origen was born around the year 184 in Alexandria, Egypt. He developed allegorical biblical interpretation and produced the Hexapla, a critical edition of the Hebrew Bible placing 6 different versions side by side. He was among the first systematic biblical scholars in the history of Christianity. These 4 men lived in different centuries and worked in different contexts. And that distinction matters for understanding their individual contributions accurately. What they share is geography. Augustine in Algeria, Athanasius in Egypt, Tertullian in Tunisia, Origen in Egypt. The creeds, the theological vocabulary, the doctrines of grace and Trinity that most Western Christians inherited were substantially shaped by men who lived and worked on African soil. That is historical documentation. The dates are verifiable. The cities are on the map. The texts these men wrote are still being studied in seminaries around the world. Now, step back and look at all 6 together. The Cushite woman anchors a conflict that draws a direct divine response. Ebed-Melech acts at the exact moment when a prophet is about to die, and no one with more power will move. The Queen of Sheba arrives at the height of Solomon's reign and becomes the figure who tests and verifies his wisdom for the reader. Simon of Cyrene is present at the crucifixion with a family known in the early church. The Ethiopian official is among the earliest named individuals to receive the gospel in a personal encounter and carries it home with joy. The African church fathers are present when Christianity's core doctrines are being formed and defended. These are not crowd scenes. These are moments where the story turns. And at each one, an African figure is not watching from the outside. They are acting from the inside. It is difficult to treat this pattern as insignificant. In ancient literature, as carefully constructed as the biblical text, the placement of specific figures at specific moments reflects intentional craft. And the pattern here points consistently in one direction. The story was always bigger than the version you were handed. And the people who knew it best were not the people who built the seminaries of the Western world. They were the people who built churches in northeastern Africa and kept reading texts that the rest of the world eventually stopped reading. Which brings us to the most important library you have never been told about. Most Christians in America grew up with a Bible that contains 66 books. They were told, implicitly or explicitly, that those 66 books represent the complete and final Word of God as recognized by the universal church. Most people never questioned that number. Most people never asked who decided it, when they decided it, or whether there were other communities of Christians who made different decisions and kept reading different texts. There is, and it has been there for over 1,600 years. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church holds a canon broader than the 66-book Western Protestant Bible, with the core tradition encompassing approximately 81 books, though the precise count reflects variations across different communities within the tradition. The same God, the same Jesus, the same resurrection, but additional texts that the Ethiopian Church has been reading, preserving, copying, and teaching from since before Augustine wrote his Confessions. Since before most of the theological infrastructure of Western Christianity existed in its current form. Before we go any further, I want to establish something clearly. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is not a fringe movement. It is not a modern invention. It is one of the oldest continuously existing Christian institutions on earth. Its roots trace to the 4th century CE, when Christianity became the official religion of the Aksumite Empire, one of the most powerful kingdoms of the ancient world. The Church has maintained unbroken institutional existence through the rise and fall of empires, through the colonial era, through the 20th century, to the present day. It is a church of tens of millions of members with its own theological tradition, its own liturgical language in ancient Ge'ez, and its own canon of scripture that it has never abandoned. That is historical documentation. It is verifiable. It is not in dispute. Now let us talk about how different Christian communities came to hold different canonical boundaries. And here the history is more complex than any simple summary can fully capture. Different Christian communities, in different geographic and political contexts, made different decisions about canonical boundaries across several centuries. The Council of Laodicea in the year 363 and the Council of Carthage in the year 397 established canonical lists that reflected the consensus of particular churches at those moments. The Protestant Reformation in the 1500s led to further changes. The King James Bible, printed in 1611, settled on 66 books as the standard for most of Protestant Christianity. The Ethiopian Church was not present at those councils in any meaningful capacity, and the Ethiopian Church did not accept their conclusions. But it is more accurate to say that different Christian communities inherited different canonical boundaries shaped by their different historical contexts. rather than to frame this as one side simply removing what another side preserved. Canon formation was a complex process unfolding across centuries in communities that were often geographically separated and theologically distinct from one another. What the Ethiopian Church did, with extraordinary consistency and care, was preserve its own canonical tradition across 1,600 years of history. And that tradition includes texts that the Western Protestant canon does not contain. Now here is where the manuscript evidence becomes significant, because this is not simply a matter of one tradition claiming authority over another. There is physical evidence. And the physical evidence is remarkable. In 1947, a collection of ancient manuscripts was discovered in caves near the Dead Sea in what is now Israel. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain texts dating from the 3rd century BCE through the 1st century CE. Among those texts were Aramaic fragments of a book called 1st Enoch. 1st Enoch is one of the texts in the Ethiopian canon. It is not in the Western Protestant Bible. It appears in the New Testament book of Jude, which contains a direct quotation from it. But the Western Church did not include the book itself in its final canon. The Aramaic fragments found at Qumran show that 1st Enoch was being read in Jewish communities in the 200 years before the birth of Jesus. The text was not a late invention. It was not a medieval fabrication. It was an ancient document, widely circulated and considered significant in exactly the period scholars describe as foundational for the development of the biblical canon. Michael Knibb, a scholar of Second Temple Judaism at King's College London whose work on the Aramaic fragments of Enoch is among the most detailed in the field, has established that the Ethiopic text of 1st Enoch represents a careful and ancient transmission. His conclusion is not that the Ethiopian Church was right about every canonical question. His conclusion is that the text the Ethiopian Church preserved is genuinely ancient and represents a tradition that predates the New Testament. Think about what that means for a moment. A church in northeastern Africa, preserving a manuscript, copying it in Ge'ez across 16 centuries. And when the world finally digs up the caves at Qumran and pulls out the Aramaic originals, the match is there. The text was real. The tradition was sound. The church that kept reading was keeping something worth keeping. The same pattern holds for the Book of Jubilees. Jubilees is another text in the Ethiopian canon, absent from the Western Protestant Bible. Fragments of Jubilees were also found at Qumran, establishing that it was widely read in the 200 years before the birth of Jesus. James van der Kam, a scholar of Second Temple literature at the University of Notre Dame, whose work on Jubilees has been published in multiple peer-reviewed journals and academic volumes, has established that Jubilees was a significant and widely read text in the period of Second Temple Judaism. The Ethiopian Church kept reading it, and the manuscript evidence shows that what they were reading was genuinely ancient. Now, I want to be precise about what I am and am not claiming. I am not claiming that the Ethiopian canon is definitively correct and the Western canon is definitively wrong. Canon formation is a complex, historical, and theological question that scholars of multiple traditions have been engaging seriously for centuries. Different communities with different histories made different decisions. Those decisions carry different kinds of authority for different communities. What I am claiming is something more specific and more verifiable. The Ethiopian Church preserved ancient texts. The manuscript evidence establishes their antiquity. And those texts engage the African presence in the covenant story with a depth and directness that the 66-book Western canon does not fully contain. Edward Ullendorf, whose work Ethiopia and the Bible, published by the British Academy in 1968, remains one of the foundational texts in the field, documented the extraordinary depth of the Ethiopian Church's engagement with Scripture. He was writing as a scholar of Semitic languages and Ethiopian culture. not as a theologian arguing for any particular canonical position. And his conclusion was that the relationship between the Ethiopian Church and the biblical texts it preserved represents one of the most significant and most underappreciated chapters in the history of Christian scripture. Now let us think about what it means that this church existed. While Western Christianity was consolidating its canonical and theological framework, the Ethiopian Church was copying manuscripts in Ge'ez and building a liturgical tradition that incorporated those manuscripts into its worship, its theology, and its understanding of its own identity. The Ethiopian Church never accepted the Hamitic myth. It never taught that African peoples were cursed. It never read Genesis 9 as a justification for racial hierarchy, because it was reading a broader canonical tradition, one in which the geography of covenant included the rivers of Cush, the land of northeastern Africa, the people the prophets named as my worshippers. And it kept reading through everything. Through the rise of Islam in the 7th century, through the medieval period when the Ethiopian Church was largely isolated from the rest of the Christian world, through the colonial era, through the 20th century, to the present day, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church never stopped reading. When we ask what the Bible says about the people it calls Cush and Ethiopia, we are not asking a question in a vacuum. We are asking it in the context of an interpretive conversation that has been going on for over 2,000 years. And one of the oldest and most continuous voices in that conversation belongs to a church in northeastern Africa that has been reading the relevant texts with seriousness and care since before most of the Western theological tradition existed. That church read these texts and saw themselves in them, not because they were projecting a modern identity onto an ancient document, because the text named them by the geography of their homeland, by the rivers that ran through their land, by the posture of worship that the prophets described, by the ancient manuscripts their scribes preserved with extraordinary care across 16 centuries of history. The books kept the promise, and the church kept the books. We have now established the foundation, the geographic anchor in Genesis, the prophetic portrait across Isaiah and Zephaniah and the Psalms, the 6 figures at the hinge points of the narrative, the 1600-year witness of the Ethiopian Church, the ancient manuscripts that the caves at Qumran confirmed. Now we are ready for the harder conversation, because if all of this was in the text, if all of this has been accessible to anyone willing to read carefully, the question that remains is not what does the Bible say? The question is, why were so many people never given access to this reading? And that question has an answer grounded in documented historical processes. An answer worth understanding clearly before we arrive at the one this entire video has been building toward. There is a specific kind of loss that does not take your money or your lands. It takes your understanding of who you are. It takes the framework through which you read your own story. It takes the theological vocabulary that would allow you to place yourself inside the narrative you have been worshiping from your entire life. That kind of loss happened. It was the result of specific historical processes with names and dates attached to them that we can examine and document. Understanding those processes is not about assigning personal blame across centuries of history. It is about understanding how interpretive traditions develop, what forces shape them, and why the tradition most Black Americans inherited consistently produced a reading experience in which African presence in the biblical narrative was less visible than the text itself suggests it should be. Let us start with the most foundational piece of that process. In the 17th and 18th centuries, as the transatlantic slave trade was expanding, a theological problem presented itself to the people who were building economic systems on forced labor. The Bible they were reading was full of statements about human dignity, about the image of God in every person, about justice and liberation, and the God who hears the cry of the oppressed. You cannot read Exodus without noticing that God takes sides with enslaved people. You cannot read the prophets without encountering a God who judges nations for their treatment of the vulnerable. The solution certain interpreters reached for was Genesis chapter 9. Noah curses Canaan, the son of Ham, after Ham sees his father's nakedness. That is what the text says. The curse is on Canaan, not on Ham, not on all of Ham's descendant, Canaan. The text is precise about this. The curse is limited and specific. But certain interpreters took that specific and limited text and stretched it into something the text never said. They argued that Ham's descendants, broadly identified as African peoples, were destined for perpetual servitude. They preached it from pulpits. They wrote it into theological texts. They built it into the curriculum of the institutions that trained the pastors who trained the congregations who accepted it as biblical truth. David Goldenberg, in his book The Curse of Ham, Race and Slavery in Early Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, published by Princeton University Press in 2003, provides one of the most comprehensive scholarly analyses of this interpretation ever written. His conclusion is unambiguous. The racial reading of the Hamitic curse is not in the original text. It was constructed and applied centuries after the text was written, to serve purposes that had nothing to do with what the biblical writers intended. The idea that dark skin was a divine punishment, that African peoples were destined for servitude by a curse in Genesis, is not biblical exegesis. It is a misreading that accumulated institutional weight across generations until it felt like established theology. That misreading had consequences measured in millions of lives. Now, I want to be careful about the next part of this history, because the honest account is more nuanced than a simple narrative allows. The interpretive pattern operated at multiple levels simultaneously, reinforcing itself through translation choices, curriculum decisions, and institutional practices across different centuries and different contexts. These were not always the result of conscious coordination. Different decisions were made by different people in different contexts, and they accumulated into a consistent pattern. Understanding that accumulation is not the same as claiming a single, coordinated effort to suppress a specific message. Take translation. The word Cushite appears throughout the Hebrew Bible as a specific geographic and ethnic identifier. Across centuries of English translation, that word was rendered inconsistently, sometimes as Ethiopian, sometimes as Cushite, sometimes with footnotes explaining the geography, and sometimes without any explanation at all. The result was that a modern reader could encounter the same figure described differently in different Bible editions. Losing the ability to trace a consistent identity across the text, each translation decision seemed unremarkable on its own. The accumulated effect was that African presence in the biblical narrative became harder to recognize as a coherent and continuous thread. Take curriculum. Corey Edwards, in her book The Elusive Dream, published by Oxford University Press in 2008, documents the effects on Black Christians of receiving a religious tradition that consistently centers European figures and frameworks. Her research shows that when people cannot find themselves reflected in the stories told about the God they worship, that absence has measurable effects on spiritual confidence, sense of belonging, and religious identity. The seminary curriculum that trained most American pastors across the 19th and 20th centuries was built around European theological frameworks and a canon of commentators that was largely European. That is documented in the academic literature on theological education. When pastors are trained in systems that do not emphasize African presence in Scripture, they graduate and preach without that emphasis. And when generation after generation of pastors preach without it, congregations grow up without it. Colin Kidd, in The Forging of Races, documents this accumulation with historical precision. His argument is not that individual interpreters were acting in coordinated bad faith. His argument is that the cumulative weight of choices made across generations, each one seeming unremarkable on its own, produced a tradition with a very specific and very consistent shape. Now let us talk about a specific and documented historical reality of the antebellum period. In many American states before the Civil War, laws prohibited teaching enslaved people to read. This is a documented historical fact recorded in the legal codes of multiple states. The reasoning was understood at the time. Literacy opened access to the text directly, and direct access to the text was understood as carrying consequences for the social order. It is important to be precise here. The legal prohibition of literacy in specific states at specific times is historical fact that we can verify in the legal record. What followed from that, in terms of what biblical content was made available to enslaved communities, varied significantly by context, by denomination, and by individual. The consistent thread was not a single policy but rather the accumulated effect of many different decisions, made by many different people, across many different contexts, that together shaped what generations of Black Americans were taught to see in the biblical text. And here is what none of those accumulated effects could do. They could not change the text. The text was still there. Ebed-Melech was still in Jeremiah chapter 38. The Cushite woman was still in Numbers chapter 12. The Ethiopian official was still going home rejoicing in Acts chapter 8. Psalm 68 verse 31 was still naming Cush with urgency and dignity. Isaiah 18 was still describing a powerful and feared people bringing gifts to Zion. Zephaniah 3:10 was still calling a people beyond the rivers of Cush my worshippers. The accumulated weight of interpretive choices could limit access to those texts. It could shape what got preached and what got moved past. But it could not remove them. It could not rewrite them. It could not make them say something other than what they say. Will Gaffney, Rodney Sadler, Randall Bailey, and other scholars working in the field of African American biblical hermeneutics have been building this case in peer-reviewed publications for decades. Their work is serious academic engagement with the text, conducted with the rigor the scholarly community demands. And it has been accumulating in academic journals and university presses for a generation. The scholarship exists. It is accessible. And the distance between what that scholarship has established and what reaches most Sunday morning congregations reflects the same pattern of emphasis and de-emphasis that we have been tracing throughout this video. But something is changing. The internet removed the accumulated barriers to biblical scholarship. A person in Atlanta or London or Lagos or Port-au-Prince can now access the same academic resources that were previously available only to seminary students at institutions that did not emphasize this material. They can read Goldenberg on the Hamitic myth. They can read Ullendorf on Ethiopia and the Bible. They can read the Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship that confirms the antiquity of First Enoch. They can read for themselves. And when people read for themselves, they find what has always been there. They find their people named. They find their heritage present. They find a portrait in the text that is not the portrait they were handed. That is not the end of a story. That is the beginning of one. And we are now ready for the answer. The one this entire video has been building toward from the very first moment. We have come a long way together. We started with a question that most pulpits never asked. We went into the Hebrew text and found a geographic anchor in the second chapter of Genesis. We followed Cush through 30 appearances in the Tanakh and watched a consistent portrait emerge across books written centuries apart. We sat with the prophetic language of Psalm 68 and the vision of Isaiah 18 and the covenant language of Zephaniah 3:10. We met 6 figures who stood at the hinge points of the biblical narrative. We spent time with a church that has been reading these texts for over 1,600 years and preserved ancient manuscripts that archaeological discovery later confirmed. We traced the historical processes that shaped what most Black Americans were taught to see in the text and what they were taught to look past. Now it is time to answer the question. But before I give you the answer, I need to tell you what kind of answer this is. Because the kind of answer matters as much as the answer itself. This is not a doctrinal claim in the technical theological sense. No mainstream biblical scholar, not Walter Brueggemann, not John H. Walton, not any figure in the academic consensus, has argued that the Bible contains a formal doctrine about the unique theological purpose of any single racial group. And I am not going to claim what the evidence does not support. What this is something different, something older, something that does not need the permission of a Western academic consensus to be taken seriously, because it has been held and lived and preserved by a community that predates that consensus by over 1,000 years. This is the answer that emerges when you lay Genesis and the Psalms and Isaiah and Zephaniah and Jeremiah and Acts and the witness of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and the manuscript evidence and the theological work of African Church fathers all next to each other and ask, what does all of this, taken together, suggest about how the biblical writers and prophets and the communities that preserved these texts understood the people they called Cush and Ethiopia? Take a breath here, because what comes next is what this entire journey has been moving toward. The portrait suggests a people whose defining characteristic in the prophetic imagination is not servitude, not curse, not absence, not marginality. The portrait suggests a people whose hands are shown reaching toward heaven, reaching before the wealth arrives, reaching before the nations come, reaching before anyone tells them it is time, moving toward God with the urgency the Hebrew verb describes, bringing gifts to Zion voluntarily, being called my worshippers by the prophetic voice before they are called anything else, standing at the moments when the story turns and acting with the kind of courage and clarity that the text records and does not forget. That portrait did not begin with the slave ships. It did not begin with colonialism. It did not begin with anyone's decision about what history the people of the African diaspora were allowed to have. It began in the text. It was placed there by writers who lived thousands of years before the historical processes that tried to minimize it. And it has been preserved, continuously and carefully, by a church that never stopped reading it. Now, let me say something I want you to hear very carefully. The portrait in the text is not a claim of racial superiority. I want to be absolutely clear about this, because the history of racial theology on every side is full of the damage that claims of divine racial hierarchy have caused. The portrait I am describing is not that Black people are better than other peoples, or more loved by God than other peoples, or destined to rule over other peoples. That is not what the text shows, and it is not what I am saying. What the text shows is something more specific and more demanding than superiority. It shows that a specific people appear at specific moments with a specific posture, a posture of reaching. A posture of moving toward God before the surrounding world has made that movement safe or comfortable or rewarded. A posture that the prophets described with urgency and that the narrative confirmed through the figures who acted from it. Ebed-Melech did not wait for the political situation to become favorable before he went to the king. The Ethiopian official did not wait for someone to come to him before he started reading Isaiah 53. The Cushite woman did not defend herself before God responded on her behalf. The African church fathers did not wait for European theological institutions to give them permission before they engaged the hardest questions of the faith with full force. The posture is not passive. It is not waiting for validation from the outside. It is the posture of people who know where they are going and move toward it with the urgency the text describes. Howard Thurman. writing in 1949, describes something he observed in the historical experience of the disinherited that connects directly to this portrait: a quality of spiritual directness, a refusal to let the structures of oppression become the final word about who you are or what you are capable of reaching. He was describing something he had seen in the black church across generations of pressure. And what he was describing, without using these specific texts, was the posture that Psalm 68 calls hastening to stretch out her hands. James H. Cone, in The Cross and the Lynching Tree, argued that the black church's experience of suffering gave it access to a reading of the crucifixion that the comfortable church could not reach. He was arguing that position and experience shape what you are able to see in the text, and the position of the African diaspora, shaped by 400 years of documented suffering and 400 years of persistent faith, is a position from which certain things in the biblical narrative become visible that are harder to see from the center of comfort and power. What those things add up to, when you read them together, is a portrait of a people the text refuses to forget. A people it places at the center when the center matters most. A people whose hands are shown reaching before anyone tells them it is time to reach. A people whose worship is described as voluntary and urgent and covenantal. A people whose theological contributions built the doctrinal foundations of a global faith. A people whose church kept ancient manuscripts that the rest of the world set aside, and whose preservation of those manuscripts was confirmed by the caves at Qumran. That is not the portrait of a cursed people. That is not the portrait of a people whose story begins with chains and ends with waiting for someone else's theology to rescue them. That is the portrait of a people the text names with intention, placed at decisive moments, described with dignity, whose reaching the prophets saw and whose courage the narrative recorded and refused to forget. The long-standing interpretive tradition of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, the African-American theological scholarship of Thurman and Cone and Gaffney and Sadler and Bailey, and the manuscript evidence that confirms the antiquity of the text that tradition preserved, all point toward the same reading of the biblical portrait. Not a doctrine of racial supremacy, a recognition of covenantal presence, a recognition that the people the text calls Cush and Ethiopia were seen by the prophets, named by the psalmist, placed at decisive moments by the narrative, and described in terms that speak of a relationship with God that is not secondary, not derivative, not dependent on someone else's invitation. The relationship was already there. The text was always showing it. And the portrait, when you finally see it clearly, is the answer to the question this video started with. Not a guarantee of ease. Not a promise that the suffering was deserved or that the injustice was part of a plan that justified it, but a recognition, grounded in the text and confirmed by 1,600 years of faithful reading, that the people the text names were never outside the story, were never peripheral to the covenant, were never absent from the moments when God was doing something the world needed done. They were there. They were named. Their hands were reaching. And the portrait that shows that has been waiting in the text for 3,000 years, through every tradition that moved past it too quickly, through every generation that was taught not to linger on those verses. For a moment, exactly like this one, you have now seen it, and what you do with it next is the question that matters most. Something is happening right now that does not have a simple name. It is not a political movement, though it touches politics. It is not an economic trend, though it shows up in economic data. It is not simply a cultural moment, though culture is part of it. It cuts across all of those categories and connects them in a way the categories themselves cannot fully contain. And it is happening simultaneously. In Atlanta and in Lagos, in London and in Port-au-Prince, in communities that have never met each other, among people who are not coordinating with each other, in languages and traditions and frameworks that differ from each other in significant ways. And yet the same thing keeps happening. People are going back to the text. People are asking questions that the tradition they inherited did not prepare them to ask. People are finding, when they read carefully, that the portrait in the text is not the portrait they were given. I want to describe what is actually happening, document it with verifiable sources, and then invite you to sit with what it means. Not tell you what it means. Invite you to think about it seriously. Because the honest version of this conversation holds the evidence carefully and lets you draw your own conclusions. Let us start with the economic picture because the numbers are concrete and the sources are verifiable. The African Continental Free Trade Area became operational in recent years and now encompasses 54 African nations forming a single trade bloc. The World Bank has projected that full implementation could boost Africa's income by up to $450 billion by 2035, covering 1.4 billion people. 48 of the 55 African Union member nations had ratified the agreement as of 2025. This is an operational trade framework representing what would be one of the largest economic zones on the planet. In 2024, the BRICS Economic Alliance expanded its membership. Among the nations that joined were Egypt and Ethiopia. By 2025, BRICS had grown to 11 members, representing approximately 50% of the world's population and a growing percentage of global GDP. According to reports from the World Economic Forum, Africa holds approximately 30% of the world's critical mineral reserves according to documented resource assessments. The Democratic Republic of Congo supplies approximately 70% of the world's cobalt as of 2025, a mineral essential to the batteries that power the devices and vehicles the entire world depends on. The terms under which those resources are accessed are being renegotiated. Malawi enacted a ban on raw mineral exports in 2025 to encourage local processing, part of a broader pattern of African nations asserting greater control over their own resource wealth. Africa has the youngest population on Earth. The median age on the continent is 19. Europe, North America, Japan, and China are all aging rapidly with birth rates below replacement level and shrinking workforces. Africa's population of 1.55 billion is growing at approximately 2.29% annually as of 2025, with over 60% of the population under age 25. These are documented facts from verifiable sources. They are worth knowing on their own terms, independent of any theological interpretation. Now, I want to draw a clear line between the economic data and what follows, because that line matters. I am not claiming that these developments are the fulfillment of Psalm 68 verse 31. I am not claiming that the African Continental Free Trade Area is what Isaiah 18 was predicting. I am not claiming that the BRICS expansion represents princes coming out of Egypt in any direct prophetic sense. Those claims would go beyond what the evidence supports, and this video has been careful from the beginning to stay within what the evidence actually supports. What I want to do is something entirely separate from those claims. There is a long-standing interpretive tradition, held by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church and developed in African American theological scholarship, that reads the prophetic portrait of Cush as describing a people whose full participation in the world's story was understood as ongoing and generational rather than as a single completed event in the ancient past. A movement the tradition understood as continuing across generations. And separately, in a different category entirely, there is what is documented as happening in communities of African descent globally right now. Greater economic agency, greater access to scholarship, greater generational confidence, a documented surge of interest in African history and biblical identity. These are two separate observations. One is an interpretive tradition about ancient texts. The other is documented contemporary reality. Noting both in the same conversation is not the same as claiming one caused or predicted the other. It is an invitation to sit with questions that are genuinely worth asking. A question, not as conclusions. What does it mean that the people who were systematically excluded from reading the text for themselves now have greater access to it than any previous generation? What does it mean that communities whose economic self-determination was structurally prevented for centuries are, in this generation, building new frameworks for collective agency? These are questions worth sitting with seriously, not as proofs of anything, as genuine invitations to reflection. Now let me talk about the cultural and spiritual dimension, because the economic data only captures part of what is happening. There is a documented surge of interest across social media platforms, academic institutions, church communities, and independent research communities in African history, in biblical identity, in the question of who people of African descent were before the slave ships and the colonial erasure. People are learning languages. People are taking DNA tests and tracing genealogical lines back to specific regions of Africa. People are reading scholars they were never assigned in school. Churches are having conversations that would have been unusual a generation ago. This is happening in too many places simultaneously, in too many different languages and traditions, to be easily explained as a coordinated campaign. It looks, from the inside of it, like a hunger that found the conditions it needed to be expressed. And here is what that hunger is finding. People going back to the text with fresh eyes are finding their people named before the wealth arrives. They are finding their people described as worshipers before anyone invited them to worship. They are finding their people's theological contributions in the creeds they recite. They are finding their people's manuscripts confirmed by archaeology. They are finding a portrait that is part of their inheritance. That finding is happening in this generation, among people who carry the inheritance this video has been describing. Whether you understand that as the natural result of greater access to scholarship, as the working out of long-suppressed human potential, or as something that resonates with the prophetic portrait we have examined throughout this video, the reality of what is happening is the same either way. People are reading more carefully. People are finding what has always been there. And what they are finding is changing how they understand themselves, how they read their Bible, and how they carry their inheritance forward. That is worth paying attention to, whatever you call it. Everything we have covered in this video lives or dies by what you do with it next. Knowledge that stays in your head and never changes how you read, how you worship, how you understand yourself and the community you belong to, is not transformation. It is information. And information without application is just more content in a world that is already drowning in content. So this chapter is practical, specific. The chapter that tells you exactly what to do with what you now know. The first thing I want to ask you to do is something that costs nothing and takes less than an hour. Go back to 3 specific passages this week. The first passage is Numbers chapter 12. Read the entire chapter slowly. Start at verse 1 and do not skip ahead. As you read, pay attention to the repetition in that first verse. The text says Cushite twice in the same sentence. Ask yourself why. Ask yourself what the conflict is actually about, and what the divine response tells you about whose presence God was protecting. Ask what it means that one of the most celebrated leaders in the Exodus narrative raises the challenge. And the challenge is still met with a response that does not favor her position. Ask what it means for your own life that God responded before the Cushite woman had to say a single word in her own defense. Then sit with it. Do not rush to a conclusion. Let the text say what it says. The second passage is Jeremiah chapter 38, continuing through chapter 39 verses 15 through 18. Read the full context. Follow Ebed-Melech through the entire episode. Notice the detail about the rags he brought to cushion the ropes. Notice that the text identifies him at the key moments of the passage. Ask yourself what that detail about the rags tells you about who he is as a person. Ask yourself what it means that in a book full of leaders who fail at the critical moment, the one person who acts with both courage and tenderness is an outsider. Ask what that means for how you understand your own capacity to act when the people around you choose silence. The third passage is Acts, chapter 8 from verse 26 through the end of the chapter. Read it as Luke wrote it. Pay attention to every detail he includes. The official's title, his purpose in Jerusalem, the specific text he is reading, the specific question he asks, the specific emotion the text records as he leaves. Ask yourself why a writer known for economy and precision chose to include all of those details. Ask what it means that this man was already seeking God before Philip arrived. Ask what it means that he went on his way rejoicing. 3 passages. 1 week. That is where the change in how you read begins. The second thing I want to suggest is 3 books that will give you a foundation for engaging this material with the depth it deserves. The first is Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman, published by Beacon Press. It is short, it is dense with meaning, and it will change how you read the Gospels in ways that connect directly to everything we have covered tonight. Thurman was writing about the experience of reading Scripture from the margins. And once you read him, the connection between his observations and the portrait we have traced in the text becomes something you cannot unsee. The second is The Curse of Ham, Race, and Slavery in Early Judaism, Christianity, and Islam by David Goldenberg, published by Princeton University Press. More academic in its approach but accessible to anyone willing to engage seriously. Goldenberg gives you the scholarly foundation for understanding the Hamitic myth and equips you to engage that conversation with precision rather than with assertion. It is the kind of book that turns an emotional argument into an evidential one. The third is Ethiopia and the Bible by Edward Ullendorf, published by the British Academy. It is older, having been published in 1968, but it remains foundational in the field of Ethiopian biblical studies. Ullendorf connects the manuscript tradition, the interpretive history, and the geographic reality of the Ethiopian Church in ways that bring everything we discussed in Chapter 7 into fuller focus. These 3 books are the next layer of this journey. They will not tell you everything. No 3 books will. But they will give you a foundation that allows you to engage the conversation. This video opened with the kind of specificity and depth that makes the conversation worth continuing. The third thing I want to ask you to do is change how you bring this into conversation with other people. Not by arriving at every conversation with the energy of someone who has discovered something that everyone else needs to accept immediately. That approach closes doors. It makes people defensive. And it misrepresents the spirit of what we have been doing throughout this video, which is careful reading and honest engagement, not the replacement of one rigid framework with another. Try asking questions instead. Ask a friend or a family member if they have ever heard a sermon about Ebed-Melech. Ask them if they know that the Ethiopian official in Acts chapter 8 was carrying the gospel home before Paul began his first missionary journey. Ask them if they know that the men who first used the word Trinity and who defended Trinitarian theology against enormous political pressure were born and lived and died on African soil. Ask them if they have ever read Numbers chapter 12 carefully and what they think the repetition in verse 1 means. Questions open doors that declarations close. And the conversation this material invites is one that deserves to be opened carefully, with patience, and with the willingness to let people arrive at their own recognition in their own time. The fourth thing is for those of you in ministry or with any platform for teaching biblical content. These figures belong in your teaching, not as a special series dedicated to one cultural moment, as substantive parts of the biblical narrative that receive the same careful attention you give to everything else. Ebed-Melech belongs in your Jeremiah series. The Cushite woman belongs in your Numbers series. The Ethiopian official belongs in your Acts series. Augustine and Athanasius and Tertullian and Origen belong in your church history teaching, identified by their geography and understood in their African context. The adjustment is simpler than it might seem. You do not need a new curriculum. You need to linger on passages you have been moving past too quickly. You need to stop at the detail that says Cushite and ask what it means. You need to follow the Ethiopian official all the way home and ask what he was carrying with him. Read more carefully. Linger longer. Follow the details the text took care to include. The fifth thing is for those of you who are parents. What the generation growing up right now needs from you is not simply access to information. They will find the information. What they need is a framework for understanding what the information means. They need to know that the portrait in the text is part of their inheritance, not their aspiration. They need to know that their heritage was never outside the story, not added later, not argued in, present from the beginning, at decisive moments, named and described with dignity and purpose. Tell them about Ebed-Melech. Tell them about the Cushite woman. Tell them about the Ethiopian official going home rejoicing. Tell them that when they read Psalm 68 verse 31, they are reading about people who share their geographic heritage, described by a psalmist 3,000 years ago in terms of urgency and dignity and covenantal relationship with God. Let them grow up knowing that the Bible has been carrying their people's portrait for 3,000 years, waiting for a generation with the access and the clarity to read it fully. That generation is them. And the preparation they need begins with what you tell them this week. We started with a man in a pit, a cistern with no water, only mud at the bottom, and a prophet slowly disappearing into it while everyone with power chose silence. And the one person who decided to act was African. He thought about whether the ropes would hurt. He put rags between the skin and the rope. He went to the king in public and named what he saw as evil, and God made him a personal promise because of it. That story has been in your Bible for over 2,600 years. We followed that thread all the way through the Hebrew text of Genesis where the land of Cush is named in the geography of human origin, through the prophetic literature where Cush is described as a people who hasten toward God with urgency and intention, through six figures at the hinge points of the narrative who acted from that posture when the story needed someone to act, through 1,600 years of Ethiopian witness that preserved ancient manuscripts the Dead Sea Scrolls later confirmed, through the historical processes that shaped what most Black Americans were taught to see in the text and what they were taught to look past, and we found what the portrait actually shows. Not the answer a tradition built on the Hamitic myth was designed to give. The answer the text itself carries. The answer that emerges when you read the full portrait without the accumulated filters of centuries of interpretive choices. The answer that a church in northeastern Africa has been giving for over 1,600 years to anyone willing to listen. The people the Bible calls Cush were never outside the story. They were never peripheral to the covenant. They were never absent from the moments when God was doing something the world needed done. They were there, named, described with dignity, acting with courage, building the theological foundations that billions still stand on, preserving the manuscripts that the rest of the world set aside, carrying the gospel with joy, standing at the hinge points and moving when everyone else with more power chose silence. That portrait is part of your inheritance, not because someone decided to give it to you, because the text placed it there. 3,000 years before anyone tried to tell you that your people had no place in the story. Father, we come to this moment with gratitude that goes deeper than words can reach. Thank you for a text that held on to us, even when the tradition around it did not always reflect us fully. Thank you for writers and prophets who placed our people at the center of the story and recorded it with a care that has survived 3,000 years. Thank you for a church in northeastern Africa that never stopped reading, that kept the manuscripts, that preserved the tradition across 16 centuries without losing its thread. Thank you for ancestors whose faith did not break under pressure that should have broken it, who prayed in ships and in fields and in basement meetings and in marches, whose persistence made it possible for this generation to receive what they held through everything. We ask for wisdom that can hold scholarship and faith together without losing either. The kind that can engage the hardest questions the text raises without flinching and without pretending certainty, where honest uncertainty is the more faithful position. We ask for courage. The courage of Ebed-Melech, who named what he saw as evil when everyone with more power had chosen silence. The courage of the Ethiopian official, who was already reading Isaiah 53 before anyone came to explain it, who asked the right question, who received the answer and carried it home rejoicing. The courage of Athanasius, who held his convictions through 5 exiles and outlasted every emperor who tried to break him. We ask for the kind of identity that does not need external validation to stand secure. The kind that comes from knowing your people were named in the text before the empires that tried to erase them even existed. The kind that reads Psalm 68 verse 31 and recognizes the posture being described because it is the posture that has characterized your community's relationship with God through everything the last 400 years. Contained. We ask for healing, for the generational wounds that historical processes inflicted and that still live in bodies and nervous systems and patterns of thought that no one chose to inherit. Healing that is not the erasure of history, but the redemption of it. The kind that takes what was meant to destroy and turns it into testimony. We ask for unity. The unity that comes from a shared recognition of shared inheritance. Diaspora and continent together. Different traditions and different frameworks. People separated by oceans and centuries who find, when they go back to the text together, that the text has been holding their shared portrait all along. And for the next generation, let them grow up, knowing that the reaching described in Psalm 68 is not a prophecy they are waiting to fulfill. It is a portrait of who they already are, what their people have always been, what 400 years of pressure could not stop, and what the text never forgot. Let them grow up walking in that. Now I want to leave you with a declaration. Not a declaration of superiority. Not a claim that any people is more loved by God than any other. A declaration of presence. You are named in the text. Not by a denomination that may or may not reflect you. Not by an institution that was built to center someone else. Not by a tradition that arrived in your community through chains and was taught to you by people who had reasons to edit what it said. By the text itself. By a psalmist who wrote 3,000 years ago about a people whose hands were already reaching before the wealth arrived, and before anyone told them it was their turn. By prophets who saw a people beyond the rivers of Cush and called them my worshippers, the daughter of my dispersed ones, and described them bringing gifts to Zion voluntarily, urgently, with the posture of people who know where they are going, by a narrative that placed your people at the center when the center mattered most and recorded their names and their actions and their courage with the care of writers who understood that what they were writing would need to last. You are named. Your heritage was never outside the story. Your hands have been reaching for 3,000 years. And the portrait that shows that, placed in the text by prophets who saw it coming, preserved through 1,600 years of Ethiopian witness, confirmed by the manuscripts at Qumran, built into the creeds by men born on African soil, That portrait is part of your inheritance. It is still there. And now, so are you. Walk named. Walk, knowing where your hands have always been pointing. Walk in the fullness of an inheritance that 3,000 years of history could not erase. That 1,600 years of faithful reading preserved. And that you are the generation, in this moment, to receive fully and carry forward. The text was waiting for you to read it clearly. You have read it. Now, walk in it. Amen.